This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Sue Onslow. It gives me great pleasure to chair this first inaugural lecture in our Making of the Modern World series. And I'm delighted that my friend and colleague here, as a Senior Research Fellow, Keith Somerville, is going to be giving the first presentation. We could not be more fortunate in our speaker today, in that Keith has, shall we say, a deep practitioner's knowledge, as well as an academic approach to this issue of propaganda and information. I also think that the fact we're having this discussion in the midst of a British election, with a number of examples all around us about use of information, misinformation, presentation, propaganda, the seductive, prescriptive approach of uses of stories, is very much something that is of contemporary importance in today's political language. I know Keith is going to adopt a historical approach in his analysis of how states have used, manipulated, presented, consorted, shaped and framed various narratives. He's going to be drawing upon a wide range of, as I say, historical resources, but bringing it very much up to date.
Yeah, that's me.
So what Keith would like to do is to give his presentation and then for us to have a question and answer session. We are doing a podcast of this particular discussion, so it's going to go out to a wider audience than those of you who are assembled here today. So thank you very much indeed for coming, and over to Keith.
Right. I'm actually going to stand up to do this because this screen is slightly in the way, and I tend to prefer to stand up and move without. Now I'm going to start with something that you may find a bit odd, but there is a rationale behind it. And this is the first piece. And I want you to listen carefully, particularly if you can pick up the words of the songs. There is a reasoning behind this. It's not just a pathetic excuse to play a bit of music. And Martin and Elsa, who work in the World Service, know we always used to find excuses to play music or other sound to liven things up. And sometimes it was totally extraneous. This isn't. Now this is the first piece. I'm not going to play all of these. And I do apologise about the content, but the content is what is important. Here's the first one.
My crew, my dogs, set rules, set laws. You represent for the lords of yards. I got alone, I feel like my... From them I par in a kitchen man yard. Build the fire, make we burn them. From them I drink in a kitchen man bar. Build the fire, make we burn them. Do you see what I see?
That's the first one. Here's the second one, and it's not Abbey Road. This one's a little bit more obvious. Okay, and now the final piece.
Basketball team.
Oh, some rough girls, some rockers, man. They got tattoos and some hardcore hoes. That's some nappy-headed hoes there.
I must apologize for the comments at length on his radio show this morning.
I'm sorry I did that. I'm embarrassed that I did that. I did a bad thing.
Now they're all slightly odd in their way. What do they have in common?
To my ears, they're incomprehensible.
I fear the sound system.
Thank God for Hitler.
They are all in their way examples of propaganda. The first piece of music by a Jamaican dancehall band called TOK, Taking Over Kingston, was called Chichi Man. Chichi Man is a Jamaican slang word for abusing gay people. And the words of the song said, "Set a fire in the Chichi Man bar, burn them, burn them." It's part of a theme, a nasty discourse within certain communities, within certain styles of music, even within certain commentators in Jamaica against gay people, where there are attacks on gay bars and gay people. The second song, by a slightly better known for people of a certain age band, Steel Ice Band, was called Little Sir Hugh. Now the way the words have been changed, it's all about a young boy being murdered by an evil woman who lures him into a castle, stabs him and drains off his blood. It's actually based on an event that happened in Lincoln to a young boy called Hugh that became the excuse for anti-Jewish pogroms. Why I played a particular bit about him being laid on a table, stabbed like a sheep, and the blood drained out of him, was what has become known as the blood libel against Jews. The idea that Jews will drain the blood of Christian children to make matzo meal, to make ritual biscuits, matzo cakes that are consumed at Jewish holidays. And it was part of a libel, a defamation, and that particular event, a boy was supposed to be found dead in a well and supposed to have been killed by the Jewish community as part of a ritual, and this was used as an excuse for a pogrom, for looting, and then for the king at the time basically to take the wealth of the Jewish community because he needed money to fight a war in France. But again, songs like that passed around became part of an anti-Jewish discourse across the years in Britain, and you can find it in other countries as well. Hitler, of course, is much more obvious. His mass rallies that were broadcast over the radio were an important part of Nazi propaganda. Not only in the rise of the Nazi Party, the rise of a particular ideology, but once they had gained power and they had control over the radio, they would put on these massive rallies on a regular basis and broadcast them across the country, particularly trotting out their propaganda against Germany's Jews, against Britain, France, until the Nazi-Soviet pact against the Soviet Union, and then once they'd invaded the Soviet Union went from being something you didn't really talk about too much in the propaganda to the swamp-dwelling Asiatics who are going to destroy European civilization. So all parts of propaganda. And the final one, Don Imus. He, along with people like Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, a whole load of what are known as the shock jocks, the American talk show hosts, who tend to be at the right of the political spectrum in the United States, tend to perpetrate a brand of racism, extreme intolerance to anything they define as liberalism, and that includes probably most of the mainstream of the Republican Party, not just Democrats. And Don Imus got in trouble, but was only briefly off the airwaves, for referring to the black female basketball players of Rutgers University as he put it, a load of nappy-headed hoes. And he thought this was perfectly good language to use in a radio broadcast. And you get equivalence of it and acceptance of these discourses. And they are all part of different discourses of propaganda. And what I want to try and sort of start from talking about propaganda isn't just Hitler, isn't just the sort of thing we maybe associate the word with. And so I've deliberately sort of come in wearing two items of propaganda about my person. One is very obvious, the Free Palestine band. The other one, less obvious, is the little rhino, which is representative of the Save the Rhino campaign. And campaigns like that, conservation campaigns, ecological campaigns, political campaigns, they all involve an element of propaganda. Because ultimately, what propaganda is there for is to persuade people. To persuade people to change their views on things. And ideally, with most propaganda, it's change views so that actions change. It's not just about putting across a particular set of ideas. It's getting people to accept those ideas to such an extent that they may change their actions. So, while I believe that propaganda goes on a huge spectrum, and that even organisations like the BBC World Service that Martin, Elsa and I all worked for, in its way had elements of propaganda in it. Not the deliberate propaganda aimed at convincing people to adopt a certain viewpoint and therefore to adopt certain actions, but it contained within it certain values, and you were getting across values. Values of humanism, of democracy, of human rights. Because we were always criticised by various governments for our particular interpretation of human rights. So even something that was a form of soft diplomacy with, and I'm sure we all felt that while we were broadcasting, we were doing something that was good. We were doing something that was actually helping people by informing them. We're still perpetrating in a way a set of values. But I'm going to be looking at the area of propaganda which is about the deliberate, the very well worked out, very consistent, and above all, repetitive use of sets of ideas to try and convince people to adopt different approaches to the world they live in, to accept particular policies, to follow particular actions, or, and it's still in a way changing behaviour, and this was particularly the case with the Nazis and the German population, in acquiescing in policies, accepting policies that they might otherwise not accept. Propaganda is really a word that has gained huge currency, particularly in the 20th century and carried over into this century. But it's been around for years and years and years, for centuries, in fact more than centuries, more or less since the start of man, when man could first communicate. But it really came of age in the 20th century as the means of disseminating propaganda became more sophisticated and could reach ever bigger audiences. But I will go back and look a little bit at the history. But probably one of the first really key times when propaganda came into public cognizance, where people began to think, actually, do we believe what we're being told? Is this true? Was during the First World War. And the American communications theorist Harold Laswell picked up on this. He identified the distaste with which many in the USA and Western Europe viewed the wartime use of information. And this is what he said about it. They're puzzled, uneasy, or vexed at the unknown cunning which seems to have duped and degraded them. These people probe the mysteries of propaganda with that compound of admiration and chagrin with which the victims of a new gambling trick demand to have it explained. Because after the First World War, people began to question, as the extent of the suffering and the deaths caused by the war really came to be appreciated, began to question, why had they continued with it? Why had we got involved with the war? What was the war about? And they began to, those who took an interest in it, question what it was about and what they'd been convinced into thinking. And Phil Taylor, the late Phil Taylor, who wrote several extremely good books on propaganda, including The Munitions of the Mind, he refers to propaganda actually as something as misunderstood, normally perceived as a dirty word involving dirty tricks, a process designed to seduce people into believing something they would not otherwise have believed. Now, I think propaganda is wider than that, but I am going to concentrate, as I've said, on the areas where people are much more obviously being persuaded. And the image in the 20th and 21st centuries has been largely a negative one for the word. People see only the arguments of their opponents as propaganda. Their own arguments could never be that. So when you look at Cold War propaganda, and I and Elsa as well work with me in monitoring, BBC monitoring, I monitored Soviet radio broadcasts in English to Europe, North America, South Asia and to Africa. And it was very clear. Every single broadcast I listened to was a work of propaganda. The news was presented from a particular viewpoint. The comment was there from a particular viewpoint. The way things were analysed, the whole value system behind it was, our system is right, the capitalist system is totally wrong, we're going to point that out and we're going to point out why. But one of the things within Soviet propaganda is very interesting. When I started studying it for a book I wrote a couple of years ago, is that one of the ever-present themes in Soviet propaganda is that we want peace. We are the peaceful country. In the Cold War, we're actually the victims, and all we want is to live peacefully with everyone else. And curiously, in the late 1940s, the newly founded CIA was asked to look at Soviet propaganda in the media, in the Soviet media, and in media perhaps influenced in other countries by it. And they found that this stress on peace was the biggest theme. But it was clearly a form of propaganda to say, yes, we're in the arms race as well, yes, we are building missiles, yes, we have got nuclear weapons, but we need them to maintain the peace, and peace is our aim. And it was a constant refrain. Whereas if you look on the other side, the British and the Americans in particular, and their other allies, would say, well, no, we're telling the truth. They're engaging in propaganda, we're telling the truth. Even when they set up very deliberately in the United States propaganda stations in Europe, like Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, whose aim was to counter Soviet propaganda and to spread their own particular propaganda in Eastern Europe. So, in a way, the term propaganda has become a stick with which you beat your opponent. We tell the truth, you deal in propaganda. Trying to define it, when we seek to persuade someone to accept or act on our views, however laudable the purpose, we are trying to in some way control or manipulate their opinions, and then if desired, their actions. This form of propaganda, as opposed to the sort of very soft diplomacy, as I put it, of something like the BBC, is very deliberate. Very interesting French writer Jacques Ellul says, the target of propaganda is individuals, groups, and also the mass of the population. And propaganda will first of all address itself at one and the same time to the individual and to the masses. It cannot separate the two elements. And propagandists, and Goebbels was a particularly astute and unpleasant expert in doing this, have tried to get the individual to feel totally and inseparably part of a mass. So when he broadcast, as he did on a regular basis, as well as controlling the Ministry of Enlightenment and Propaganda, as it was called, he was very clearly trying to get his audience individually to see themselves as part of a mass, which was part of a movement, and that if you were not part of that, you were somehow an outsider. And he always said, and if you read his diaries and his writings, that he was never trying to argue with people he knew had strong opinions against his, because it was a waste of time. What he wanted to do was to seize those bits of people's beliefs, their emotions, and feed back to them in a way that he reinforced those parts that made them feel part of the mass. And the mass he wanted them to feel part of was the mass Nazi movement, and then during the war as part of the German war effort to keep people, even if you couldn't make them enthusiastic for the war, which is something he largely accepted, particularly in the latter stages, you still had to get them to support the war effort and to continue to believe somehow in German victory. What he didn't do, interestingly, is when you look at the anti-Semitic propaganda put out by the Germans, by the Nazi Party, it wasn't like Rwanda, where the discourse of the Hutu power movement, of radio, television libre de mille collines, the whole discourse of that is come out actively, join the militias like the Interahamwe, pick up your machete, man the roadblock. We will even give you registration numbers of cars on the radio to stop those cars and kill the people in those cars, or to go to certain areas and kill the people there, because they are Tutsis, they are your enemies. Get involved. Actually, really a call to very violent action. But what the Germans wanted, what the Nazi Party wanted, was acquiescence and acceptance of a programme. Not that you are to go out and attack your Jewish neighbours, but you are to support the programme in which that's being done. Because they were very, very careful that in all the propaganda, and I actually read every single transcript the BBC monitoring service has of German domestic radio broadcasts during the Second World War. Not once do they incite people to actually go out and attack Jews. Not once do they actually say, we are going to exterminate the Jews. Instead, it's the Jews will be exterminated because they started the war. They were behind the war. They were behind Churchill, behind the French in their guarantees to Poland, behind the Americans when they came into the war. But not once do you actually find somebody saying, even Goebbels saying, we are actively exterminating the Jews. They'll say we are solving the Jewish problem. We are moving the Jews out of Germany. There will be no Jews left in Germany. But they were very different in their propaganda to the Rwandans, the Rwandan Hutu movement, which was very much, we need you all to go out and actually get involved in this. So there are differences. The key thing, though, is that these messages must be clear, must be consistent, must be repetitive, and above all else, this form of propaganda appeals to the emotions, not to reason. You are not appealing to somebody's reasoned intellect. you're picking up on emotions. And you're picking up on emotions of fear, maybe of greed, of grievance. Not altruistic emotions, but emotions that you can use, you can manipulate fear of others. So the Hutu propaganda in Rwanda was all about manipulating fear of Tutsi subordination of the Hutus. Of saying, you will go back to that situation you had under Belgian colonialism where the Tutsi were at the top of the hierarchy and you, the Hutu, are at the bottom. If you want that, do nothing. If you don't want that, support us, join the militias. So it was very much an emotional thing. And again, with Nazi propaganda, they didn't try and build anything that wasn't there, to create something that wasn't there. They worked on grievance over the Versailles Treaty, grievance over the poverty and destitution in Germany after the war, seized on latent and long-standing anti-Semitism within German society and built that up. They needed to have an enemy. They needed to have a scapegoat to blame the failures in the First World War, to blame Germany's woes on. And it became powers like Britain and France standing behind them, ever present. And weirdly, I had this repeated to me by somebody who I think Martin knows. I don't know if you've actually met him as I have. Clyde Darby-Lewis, the man who arranged Chris Harney's assassination. When I interviewed him in South Africa, he was part of the far-right Conservative Party. He actually repeated this whole Jewish banking communist conspiracy idea to me in 1990 in Johannesburg and said that the prime member of it, as far as he was concerned, was Margaret Thatcher. Because she was conniving in the downfall of the one system that would protect Africa against this conspiracy. So people seize on things that they can work on. I think it was Aldous Huxley, the novelist, who said, you cannot create the fire of propaganda where there is no wood. You need something to work on. And that is one of the key aspects of it. And as I said, it must be simple, have emotional impact, and I'll repeat it again, repeat the same message over and over again. And it's been used over time in history in this way. As I mentioned earlier, it's been in use really since man first communicated with other men. You could see rock paintings as a way of communicating, but also as a way of saying this is our territory. This is where we hunt, and we are great hunters. You know, these things like the White Lady of Brandberg in Namibia, which shows this, why it's called a lady, I don't know, because it is very, very clearly a man, because I've been there and seen it. This huge hunter amongst a load of smaller hunters hunting animals, and there's a symbolism there of the power of the people who painted that representation. The name propaganda, or the word propaganda, actually comes from 1622, from, I won't try and pronounce it in Latin, but it's the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith within the Catholic Church, which was set up by Gregory XV during the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation period. In fact, during the 30 Years' War. And it was set up not just to counter what they saw as Protestantism and the dangers of that, but to spread the word of Catholicism in the New World and in territories that were being visited, occupied, exploited by particularly the Spanish and the Portuguese, who were taking Catholicism and missionaries with them. And the Sacred Congregation was to propagate the faith. And this was seen as a good thing to do. And again, the idea that propaganda is something totally evil is something that's tended to develop because of its uses in the 20th and 21st centuries. For the Catholic Church, this was a good thing. This was propagating the faith. But well before then, states, powerful organisations, certainly the church, had used propaganda to increase their power or to undermine their opponents. And it has these two sides. And it's not just in times of conflict, but generally, you will try and undermine your opponent or your critics in some way. I mean, Sue mentioned it's interesting this is taking place at the time of an election. And I thought it was particularly interesting what was said to have been leaked from the Murdoch organisation the other day. The instructions to journalists on The Sun to make absolutely sure they went all out to ensure that Ed Miliband and Labour were not re-elected because they were enemies of the Murdoch organisation. And so an instruction to engage very much in propaganda against somebody and a party now seen as the enemy of that organisation. Because the priorities of the organisation, perhaps the priorities of the Labour Party have changed. So where Murdoch was once very, very much a supporter of Blair, now he is most certainly not a supporter of Miliband. That is a modern version of it, where they're not just going to build up what they see as their allies in the Conservative Party, but actually undermine. So it's the building up on the one hand and the undermining on the other hand. And states have done this, as I say, from very, very early on. They've done it in all sorts of ways. Before the era of mass communications, and particularly before the era of mass literacy, you had to use whatever forms of representation were open to you. So one form, just one particular example, was from Assyria in the first millennium BC, and King Ashurnasirpal, I hope I've got it right there, not that he's around to be insulted if I mispronounced him, he used monumental and image propaganda very carefully, and I'll read out what he says. One way he used it, and you could argue that this sort of thing is cropping up now in the sort of propaganda used by Islamic State in their videos, for example. A propaganda that is violent and is warning enemies what will happen to them if they do not accept the hegemony of that group or of a particular set of ideas. But the king had an inscription at Nineveh, at his palace in Nineveh, and he described it in this way: I built a pillar over against the city gate, and I flayed all the chief men who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skin. Ahiababa, the rebel leader, I took to Nineveh. I flayed him. I spread his skin on the wall of Nineveh. There were also massive murals in his palaces and on the walls of his cities, showing him as a hugely powerful figure. So you had, for example, the one at the top here. It shows him hunting lions from a chariot. Again, images of power. I am powerful. This is who I am. This is what I can do. The flayed bodies of rebels and my opponents, that is what I will do to you if you rebel against me. So very violent propaganda aimed at propping up his state. And it's very interesting that this form of propaganda, used by the Nazis as well, used by many states across time, combines the use of images, later on the use of words, the use of newspapers, the use of radio, television, now social media, to reinforce the power of the state, but combined with the ability of the state to punish those who act against it. So again, in Nazi propaganda throughout the 30s and during the war, there was always the threat level there, that if you stand out against us, this is what will happen to you. And so when there were show trials, for example, after the attempted assassination of Hitler in 1944, these were highlighted in the media, on radio, in the newspapers, to show this is what happens if you stand out against the Führer. You will not be forgiven. So state power and propaganda goes along with also the ability to use power of force and coercion. You also get another thread in propaganda, still a very major one, and that is the use of atrocity. and usually accusations of atrocity against your opponents. So, for example, when the Catholic Church was preaching the First Crusade, long after, in fact, the fall of Jerusalem to the Turks, they used imagery of atrocity. They appealed to a whole range of emotions in their campaign to get people to join the crusade, to finance the crusade, and also to take part in that horribly disastrous People's Crusade, where tens of thousands of unarmed people moved across Europe and eventually all died or ended up being sold into slavery on the way. But they were encouraged to take part using some of these simple emotive means. And the emotive means would be fear. They've taken Jerusalem. They're moving towards Byzantium across what is now Turkey. You will be next. You have got to act now, or you will be next. They commit atrocities, and they're all, if you read the account, people, particularly the very good one by people like Stephen Runciman, in great detail of the way they used alleged atrocities in order to convince people that both you are in danger of this happening to you and your families, but also you have a Christian duty to protect other Christians. And then you have the greed approach. They were promised land. They were promised wealth. They were also promised, if you like, in a sort of appeal to spiritual greed, forgiveness of sins. So propaganda worked on a whole range of levels there, but all very simply appealing to greed, to emotions, greed, fear, and strong emotions like that. And so, as I say, state violence, the combination of violent repression and public propaganda, is repeated down the ages. It was the case during the 30 Years' War. And that was where gradually the availability of printing presses became very important, because you could suddenly not just have to rely on those few people who could read and can get access to the laboriously written out manuscripts produced mainly in monasteries, or attendance of public meetings, because the voice was very powerful. In preaching the crusade, the Pope and bishops would go round the countryside, hold masses, and at the masses use the sermon at the mass to preach the crusade and persuade people to join up. During the 30 Years' War, you got the beginnings of the press through pamphlets, and for the illiterate, through woodcuts that could be reproduced on a massive scale, and were very important in the way now. I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say this was the 30 Years' War version of YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. These were passed around, these were distributed. So you had very soon after the famous event, the defenestration of Prague, where pro-Catholic Bohemians were thrown from the windows of the Hradčin Palace in Prague, and pretty well within weeks there were woodcuts printed off, being passed around Europe. This is what the Protestants do to Catholics. You good Catholics must unite behind the church to fight them. On the other hand, this is a woodcut by Callow of Catholic army hanging Protestant prisoners taken in battle. And this was one of the first examples of printed atrocity material being used for propaganda purposes. To get Protestants to band together behind the princes, the monarchs, who were fighting against the Holy Roman Emperor and the Catholic Church. And they would use these sort of scurrilous woodcuts. This is supposed to be the Pope. A combination of a donkey and a dragon with a devil coming out of its backside, showing the way that in fact it was the Pope and the papacy that was the representative of Satan on earth. So very graphic imagery that you could use to try and persuade people who couldn't read the pamphlets that were produced, who maybe hadn't heard the sermons, but something like this. And also it's got within it something that crops up again and again. And it cropped up in Nazi propaganda, it cropped up in Rwanda, it cropped up in propaganda on radio stations in Kenya in 2008 during the post-election violence, which is dehumanization, depicting people as cockroaches, as ravening beasts. And it was to crop up as well in British and American and French propaganda during the First World War. And I will have a couple of images from that, and here they are. These are posters used during the First World War. The ever-present accusation, and there were instances of it, of Germans bayoneting children, of Germans raping or abusing women. This is supposed to be an image, and it hasn't come out very well. Again, the image of a beast, a monkey, an ape, with a German helmet on, a meat cleaver in one hand, and that is supposed to be the figure of mercy on a chopping block. So again, the idea of atrocity and the use of atrocity stories, some perhaps real, certainly many vastly embroidered, and others totally invented, in order to say, you've got to fight these beasts, this mad brute which is Germany. Part of the propaganda. And the First World War saw the very effective use of the combination of censorship and propaganda. If you can limit the views that are expressed, the information that is available, and then monopolise that information, you have a very powerful tool for convincing people to follow what you say. So, even though it's argued that there was no direct censorship in either the First or Second World Wars, the Defence of the Realm Act within Britain set the parameters. A press bureau was set up in the First World War. So newspapers, and of course that's all people had then, newspapers. Radio didn't really, even though you had radio telegraphy, come into its own until the 1920s. The press bureau would control the reports that went to the newspapers from the front. The reports of the fighting. Any reports, and they resisted having reporters going to the front line except under very, very closely guarded and monitored situations. Soldiers were not allowed, for example, to send photographs back. Those who had early cameras could not send photographs back. So you didn't get, as you got, say, to some extent during the Second World War, but particularly from Vietnam onwards, photographs of combat or the humanitarian effects of war. So you could keep fairly well closed down what people knew about what was going on, and then you could use your access to the media and the papers of, for example, in Britain, Lord Northcliffe, who controlled the Times, the Sunday Times, the Mail, and the Evening News. He controlled, I think it was 45% of the mainstream British media, and along with him, Beaverbrook, who controlled the Express. They became consciously, and were actually drafted onto committees, part of the propaganda effort during the war. During the Second World War, or by the time of the Second World War, propaganda had moved on. And as I say, every time there's a technological advance, or technological change, propaganda takes advantage of it. So very, very quickly after the development of radio, one of the first states to use radio, initially radio telegraphy, but then broadcast radio, was the Bolsheviks in Russia. They sent messages across the telegraph. Once they had seized power in St. Petersburg and then in Moscow, they sent telegrams across the Tsarist Empire saying, we are now the government, we are now in charge. And they very quickly, with such a far-flung vast country realised the potential of radio, and they set up radio stations, broadcasting in shortwave, to broadcast propaganda across the country. It was also very quickly picked up, interestingly, by commercial broadcasters in the United States, the other leaders in broadcasting to begin with, and very soon, within the first few years of broadcasting, there was a propaganda station broadcasting. Strangely, it was a propaganda station run by a Catholic priest called Father Coughlin from the Shrine of the Sacred Flower. And he is the predecessor of people like Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Don Imus, the talk show hosts, the very, very propagandistic right-wing approach. And Coughlin was a priest, and eventually the Catholic Church did begin to tap him on the head and say, you can't keep doing this. But his program, his radio program, was syndicated across national radio stations. And he broadcast, particularly during the New Deal period, when he had fallen out with Roosevelt. Having been quite a supporter of Roosevelt at one stage, when Roosevelt kept him at arm's length, he turned violently against Roosevelt and broadcast anti-New Deal propaganda, anti-Semitic. He was hugely racist against America's black population and became quite closely linked with the Nazi Party. And Goebbels, in his diary, refers to, we must copy the methods of this priest in America. He is very effective. So you had that aspect of propaganda developing as well. The Spanish Civil War was a huge melting pot, a huge experimental conflict for all sorts of things, not just the use of air power in war, but also the use of propaganda. And the nationalists under Franco were extremely good at this, and they used fear propaganda. They would broadcast to cities that they were trying to take, warning them that if they fought against them, the people would suffer as a result. And they used this awful form of almost, it was a racist threat, because quite a large number of the troops in the Nationalist Army were North African troops, Moroccans. And they built the Moroccans up in their propaganda as basically animals. And that if you want these animals let loose upon your city, just keep fighting against us, keep resisting us, and you will then suffer. We will let them loose and they will have free reign, with all sorts of implications from building up this racist image of these as brutal soldiers who are out of control. By the time of the Second World War, the Nazi Party had been in power for 6 years, had taken over every aspect of the German media. Newspapers, radio, film, they used everything. And used it with a level of repetition, of consistent messages, and built up this whole agenda of grievance, of fear, but also of growing German power and superiority. And Alex Callis, in his very good study of Nazi propaganda, says that by promoting a common cognitive environment for information acquisition and interpretation, as well as a constant cultivation of perception of the world, and that perception of the world was of a world that had somehow treated Germany badly. And Germany had to regain its place in that world, and regain its place by fighting against those who had been suborned by this Jewish communist banking conspiracy, as it constantly hammered home, and we must fight against this. And Hitler would repeatedly say, if another war starts, it will start because of the machinations of the Jews against Germany and against the Nazi Party, and that will end in their extermination. And we will fight those who are... They had this expression, the wire pullers. Those whose wires are being pulled by this conspiracy. And they are Churchill, the French, and Roosevelt. And we will fight against them. And they used their control of the media to demand unquestioning support for Hitler, the Führer, and set up the Führer cult. Unquestioning support for the policies of the Nazi Party. And in pursuing their violent anti-Semitism, they used these dehumanizing and vastly exaggerated images. Images that presented the Jews as little better than animals, as grasping, stealing, and of course in this one you have both the money representing the banking, the Jewish control of banking and finance, the whip with which they would beat the German people, and the hammer and sickle, all indicating the conspiracy. And they didn't only use newspapers, speeches, radio, they used films. The Eternal Jew and another one called the Jew Sus, produced under Goebbels' direction, to constantly ram home this message that these are your enemies. These are basically subhumans who must be wiped out. But it wasn't just the Germans and their allies who used really pretty racist images. This is the Tokyo Kid, a series of posters and cartoons created by the Douglas Aircraft Company in America as part of a scheme to persuade their workers to work even harder to produce more aircraft for the war effort, because otherwise this horrible caricature of a Japanese person with the dagger dripping blood, with a swastika on the back of his trousers, with these awful misshapen teeth and round glasses, this caricature of a human being, these are the people who will take over this country. You have got to fight them. After the Second World War, you then had propaganda becoming an absolutely vital part of the Cold War. Competing ideas, the use of radio, of newspapers, of television when it arrived, of film. If you think of American films of the 1960s in particular, they will often have this image of the threat of the Soviet Union, the threat of communism. And similarly, when I monitored Soviet broadcasts, it was all, we are the peaceful Soviet Union, we are the peaceful Soviet bloc, we are doing whatever we can to avoid war, to help those in other countries who are fighting for their freedom, and we always come up against the warmongering capitalists. The two fought each other, but the war of words also spread into other areas. The Middle East. Gamal Abdel Nasser, when he seized power with the Free Officers movement in Egypt, he grasped very quickly in a far-flung area of the Middle East where Arabic was the common language, even though there were different dialects, different styles of Arabic, you could still reach people through broadcasting in Arabic, and he realized how powerful this could be. And he set up the Voice of the Arabs and distributed radios as much as he could in areas of the Middle East where he wanted to gain influence. He was particularly successful in encouraging opposition in the late 1950s to what was known as the Baghdad Pact, a British and American-backed alliance of states in the Middle East based on Iraq, Baghdad, with Jordan and other states, trying to get a focus of Western power, resistance both to Egypt's more radical brand of Arab nationalism, but also to the role of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. And that was very, very successful. It became part of the Arab-Israeli conflict, with both sides using radio in particular to huge effect. Of African nationalism, the Voice of the Arabs broadcast programs by African nationalist groups, as did the far less powerful transmitters of Ghanaian radio, once Ghana had achieved independence. And they would broadcast, not very often, maybe a couple of hours a week, material from various African nationalist groups, broadcasting to Africa, encouraging the cause of liberation. When it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict now, social media, the internet, Twitter are very, very important. The IDF has its own social media unit. Again, a station I listened to when I was working for the BBC Monitoring Service. I listened to Kol Israel, the voice of Israel, Israeli government radio, but also IDF radio, which interestingly was censored less heavily than Israeli government radio, and was actually a much more interesting radio station. They were much more skilled at the way they put across their version of the news. South Africa, not just within the media in South Africa, where that was very, very closely controlled by the National Party, but also Radio RSA, which broadcast to Africa, broadcast to Europe, to North America, trying to get across the South African government's opinions. Radio Freedom, the ANC radio station, which broadcast into South Africa as well as to neighbouring states, trying to generate support for the armed struggle against the apartheid system. There were also other propaganda stations in particularly southern Africa, but also in Ethiopia, for example, with the EPLF in Eritrea had its own station, the TPLF, which now forms the government in Ethiopia, had its own station, and there was a war of words, particularly in the 70s and 80s, between Mengistu Haile Mariam's regime in Ethiopia and the EPLF and the TPLF. Within Sudan, with the secessionist, well, it wasn't initially a secessionist war, the war of the SPLA against Khartoum. The SPLA had its own radio station. Radio became, particularly, I think, in Africa, a very potent weapon. You also had the depiction of, within Britain and the West, of what was happening, say, in Southern Africa. And Ian Smith, the white leader of Rhodesia, was always very good to caricature because he injured his face in an air crash in the Second World War. And this was a cover of Private Eye, sort of really caricaturing his strange face. And again, a form of propaganda. It continued through the wars in the Balkans. Milosevic, in particular, and the Serbians were adept at using propaganda. Again, atrocity and grievance propaganda. The Serbs as the victims who must band together to fight those trying to take their land or dominate them. And they used images back to the Second World War of pro-Nazi Croat concentration camps where Serbs were imprisoned. Other forms of propaganda. I mean, I played some songs to begin with. How many of you remember this? Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the 1968 Olympics in Mexico, about 2 months after the assassination of Martin Luther King, when they received their gold medals, black gloves on to represent Black Power, support for the Black Panther movement, making a very propagandistic and open show at a major international event, because the Olympics are always propaganda, particularly for the countries running them. But this was a form of counter-propaganda. And these are just somebody's identity card from Rwanda, which shows their identity. And identity was very much part of the propaganda leading up to and during the genocide in Rwanda. And now in Ukraine, and I'll finish here because I can see Sue nodding at me. If you look at what's going on in the Ukraine, the propaganda coming out from both sides matches anything during the Cold War. Russia is increasing its propaganda, its broadcasts of Russia Today, at a time, in fact, when the BBC World Service is actually shrinking and less able to broadcast perhaps a clearer version of events, But also, the European Union, for example, is setting up very openly a unit to deal with the propaganda war with Russia over the Ukraine. So there's going to be propaganda and disinformation coming from both sides. Al Jazeera is quite interesting because they're criticising both sides for their use of propaganda. But of course Al Jazeera isn't perhaps necessarily totally guiltless, particularly when it comes to some of its broadcasts in Arabic, less so its broadcasts in English. And then final slide I would put up, because this is quite an odd and controversial one. The use of social media, Twitter, Facebook, all sorts of different social media sites, it's becoming a major site for propaganda. During the last Kenyan elections, social media and SMSs were perhaps some of the major vehicles for propaganda used by the competing sides in the election. During the Arab Spring, social media was not perhaps as important as many people seem to believe it was, but it was a vehicle for getting out protests and getting out images. But there was often a question over, as there often is with social media, when you cannot verify the source, are events you are seeing or pictures you're seeing accurate ones? And this blue bra incident, as it became known, was one that is still argued over. Was this really Egyptian riot police beating up a protester and humiliating her by pulling her clothes off? A lot of people believe it was. It went around the world. I think even Hillary Clinton made a comment saying this shows the brutality and how out of touch the Egyptian police are with the young people who are protesting. But a lot of people said this was actually faked. It didn't really happen. And this was something that was used in order to create propaganda at a time when you wanted to build up national and international support. And I will take that one off because it would be very distracting. And I will stop talking now. Your ears are probably bleeding.
Keith, thank you very much. I wonder if you could also give us a summary of your views on state usages of propaganda now. You've emphasised very much hate regimes and their use of propaganda. Could you expand upon how what we might identify as less loathsome governments' regimes are adept and astute at manipulating and using propaganda?
Yeah, I mean, propaganda, as I tried to sort of make out at the beginning, while I concentrated more on the really virulent forms that tend to perpetrate hatred, in any way, when you want to try and win people over to your viewpoint, to get policies across, you will use information and the media to do that. You will place stories, or you will leak stories, or you will go all out to get your voice heard, to get your voice onto the media. So you saw massive propaganda campaigns, for example, in the US media at the time that Obama was trying to get Obamacare through Congress. He was putting across his viewpoint, his arguments, and then, because of the huge diversification of the American media, he often tended to get drowned out because the right-wing Republican media in the States is more powerful. But governments will use that. I mean, governments will use whatever means they can, I think, at the moment in Europe to get across messages they want to get over about the issue of migrants. Behind it will be, say, in Britain, the whole very, very one-sided debate, well, you can call the debate one-sided, but the very one-sided nature of coverage of immigration as a whole into Britain, where most of the major political parties, most of the major newspapers, for example, will adopt a fairly anti-immigration viewpoint, even if it's a toned down one, saying it's something we've got to look at and it can't go on as it is, rather than stop it, we've got to stop all these awful people coming here stealing our jobs. I always like the UKIP propaganda about immigration, where you get these wonderful multitasking people who come over here, who are both claiming benefits very avidly, using the health service, but working like hell to take everybody's jobs. I mean, it's a debate that is often devoid of fact, shall we say. But I think the whole issue of the migrants in the Mediterranean sort of is linked in with that. That, you know, shouldn't we be trying to stop these people? I mean, all this stuff now about bomb boats that could be used to bring migrants across. Well, surely they could also be used for fishing, which many coastal peoples in North Africa would be very aggrieved at having their fishing boats destroyed. But it's going to feed into a propaganda where actually you never really find out what is going on and what policy is. Because governments don't necessarily want you to know. They want you to know what they're thinking, not what is actually happening. So I think in a whole range of issues,